Hey golfers, welcome back to the putting channel. Hopefully by now most golfers have an understanding that there should be some arcing of the sweet spot in the putting stroke. The face should be opening and closing somewhat. Perhaps some people still believe that they want the putter to be moving straight back and through with very little rotation. In this video, I'm going to explain to you some concepts to help you understand perhaps the difference between arc and rotation, why the putter should be arcing and rotating, and hopefully that's going to lead to you making some better putting strokes with a better understanding. So watch this video and hopefully you're going to understand a little bit more about arc and rotation in the putting stroke. So let's begin by defining arc and rotation. Arc being how the sweet spot is tracking relative to a straight line when we're looking at the putting stroke from above. So I've got this straight line here with an alignment stick. It's worth pointing out that this straight line isn't necessarily the target line because our putter can arc but not have a pretty neutral path. It can be in to out or out to in. But essentially, how curved is the movement of that sweet spot relative to the view from above. So when I set up on this alignment stick, you can see the sticker on the sweet spot there. If I make my normal stroke, you can see the sweet spot coming inside and inside. So there's some arcing going on there. If I wanted to increase the arc, it would look like that. That would be a lot of arc. And if I had no arc, my stroke might look something like that. Sweet spot very much tracking that alignment stick. When it comes to rotation, we're talking about how the putter and putter face is rotating within the stroke. And we can look at that in two ways. One is absolute rotation, so that's rotation relative to target. And the other is relative rotation, so that's rotation compared to our arc or our path. So if I was to set up again on this alignment stick, if I make my normal stroke, the face is opening in my backstroke, coming back to square and closing in my follow through. My stroke doesn't have a lot of relative rotation, so my path and my face rotation are pretty much matching. If I was to increase the rotation but not increase the arc, you could say there's some relative rotation going on there, so there's some rotation about the shaft happening within that. And then a stroke with no rotation would perhaps look like this, right? I can even make a stroke with no rotation but with some arc. Kind of looks a bit funky, but that's no rotation with lots of arc. So arc and rotation, just for understanding, are two completely different things. And sometimes I see people getting those two things confused. Specifically, I'd say I see people referring to arc when they're actually referring to rotation. So hopefully that's increased your understanding of arc and rotation within the stroke. Just a quick one, if you're watching this video, then it's likely you're looking to improve your putting. And if that's the case, I'd encourage you to visit my website, jjputting.com. There you're going to find more information about me, the in-person lessons I do, the online lessons that I do, and the projects that I'm working on to help golfers around the world. So visit the website, JJ Putting, to find out more. Next, I want you to understand why the putter perhaps should have some arcing and some rotation within our stroke. I've got this kind of grip with a little bit of shaft and a laser attached, right? And hopefully you can see that laser on the ground there. And if I was to set up with a putter that's completely horizontal and I move it on plane, you can see the laser on the wall there is staying pretty straight. If I was to do that in a vertical position, the same thing is kind of happening. Now, if I was to set up how I would to a putter and I move it on plane, that laser is staying pretty straight. You can see my stroke generally is pretty on plane, and you can perhaps see why. That laser is staying pretty straight. So that means that the shaft is tracking more or less in a straight line. Now I've moved this plane board in. If I put the shaft pretty close to the plane board, and again I move it on plane, again you can see that laser tracking pretty straight. So you could say that I'm tracking the shaft, I'm moving that shaft in a pretty straight line. That is why for some people the understanding that the putter moves in a straight line can be a positive if you're thinking about the shaft and how the shaft moves. Now when I grab my putter and make that same motion, that same in-plane motion, you will see, because I'm moving in an inclined plane, the putter itself, the head, is moving up and in. And then the same happens in the follow-through, and that face is opening, closing and closing. So when I make that in-plane motion with the shaft tracking, to me it feels like I'm making a pretty straight stroke, but the reality is I'm moving it in plane, and that sweet spot is arcing and that face is opening and closing. So again, that goes back to the understanding, well, are you trying to move the shaft pretty straight, which can be a good concept for a lot of people, or are you trying to move that sweet spot straight, which creates this out of plane motion, or are you trying to keep that face square to the target? So they're three entirely different things altogether. And that is why some people will come into the studio and they tell me they're trying to make a straight stroke, and actually that's quite a good concept for them because they're trying to track the shaft. And for other people, they're concentrating on how the putter is moving. They're trying to keep this sweet spot traveling in a straight line. That's probably the most common one I see. And as a result, actually what happens, and I'll move this alignment stick in for a reference as well, what will happen often with them is they're tracking the sweet spot in a straight line, but then the face is opening a lot in their backstroke, and they have to put a lot of effort in and a lot of about the shaft rotation in order to square it. So I guess the point of this video is to improve your understanding of the concept of arc and rotation, why the putter arcs, why it rotates. And when we're referring to the putter moving in a straight line, are you thinking about the shaft tracking, or are you thinking about the sweet spot or the face? And for a lot of golfers, going back to that again, trying to track the shaft in a pretty straight line, almost forgetting about how the putter head is moving. You can have that as a feel in your hand, but moving that shaft in a pretty straight line can be a good concept for people of how the putter moves. Another very important point is that some people, perhaps with the understanding that the putter should arc, actually go about trying to make it arc. And that can often lead to a stroke that looks a little bit like this, and perhaps they're not really a golfer with their feel of the putting stroke that needs to force it to arc. Personally, like I said, I like to feel like the shaft is pretty much tracking. So if I got my training aid out and made my normal putting stroke, you can see it moves pretty much on plane. My putter does arc and my face does open and close, but I'm not really thinking about that. I'm just making what feels like a pretty square movement to me, tracking the shaft back and through. So hopefully this video's gone some way to give you a little bit more understanding of how and why the putter moves as it does. Ideally, we're going to see some arcing relative to target. Try and forget about trying to move the putter head in a certain way. Try not to force it to arc. Equally, we don't want that sweet spot tracking too linearly in a straight line. And the concept For a lot of people, I found in my coaching that the shaft is kind of tracking pretty straight, thinking more about how the grip and the shaft are moving, and then gaining feels as to how this is moving from that is a really good concept to how the putter should be moving in the stroke. So hopefully this has increased your understanding a little bit. I often say that the correct concept for a golfer is a great way for them to start making better strokes. Perhaps you need to start thinking about how the handle and the shaft are moving in order to make that putter naturally arc and naturally open and close.